Here's the opening section of your story, closely following the outline and designed to immediately hook the audience. What would you do if a self-righteous HOA leader decided your land, your family's legacy, was an abomination that needed to be fixed? What if she harassed you for months, trying to force you to comply with rules that had nothing to do with you? Now, imagine that same woman calling 911 on you, only to find out the cops were already there for her. I never asked for trouble. I run a 40-acre farm that's been in my family for generations. My parents laid down roots here back in the 1960s, long before homeowner associations started cropping up like weeds, dictating how many inches your lawn could grow before you got a fine. Out here, we live by a different set of rules, the kind that respect hard work, community, and the land itself. Unfortunately, some people don't see it that way. Karen moved in 2 years ago when the newest HOA development popped up right next to my property. From the second she arrived, she made it her mission to make my life hell. You'd think she had binoculars surgically attached to her face the way she kept tabs on me, treating my farm like it was some kind of threat to her perfect little suburban world. If it wasn't the barn's color offending her, it was the rooster crowing at dawn, the scent of my compost heap, or, God forbid, the sound of my donkey, Peanut, braying in the morning. She didn't just complain, she plotted. Every month, a new concern conveniently found its way to me. First, she left politely aggressive notes in my mailbox about neighborhood beautification efforts. When I ignored them, she escalated. The county zoning board, the health department, even the fire marshal, they all showed up at my gate at some point, responding to anonymous complaints. Of course, every inspection cleared me, but the message was clear: Karen wasn't going to stop until I bowed to her imaginary authority. The breaking point came 2 days ago. Karen stormed up to my property line, clutching a cease and desist letter as if it were a royal decree. She claimed my compost heap was a sanitation violation and demanded I remove it immediately. I barely managed to hold in a laugh. Instead, I calmly explained what composting was and how it benefited the soil. Big mistake. Karen's lips curled in disgust, her nose wrinkling like she'd just smelled something rotten. We have standards in this community, she snapped, waving a manicured hand toward the HOA neighborhood. Your farm is bringing down our property values. I offered to give her a tour, to show her exactly how the farm operated, how everything was run responsibly. I even invited her to learn about composting. After all, she seemed to have a lot of opinions about it for someone who clearly didn't understand how it worked. But Karen didn't come here for facts. She came to issue a warning. You'll be hearing from the proper authorities soon, she declared before spinning on her heel, the sharp click of her designer shoes on the gravel like a judge's gavel. I shrugged it off at first. Just another one of her petty threats, I figured. But then, the next morning, she did something I never saw coming. She called 911. On me. What Karen didn't know was that law enforcement was already scheduled to be on my property that day. Not for me, but for her. I didn't think much of Karen's threat at first. She'd been tossing them around like confetti for months, and nothing ever came of it. But by the next morning, it became clear, she was done playing games. While I was out tending to the chickens, spreading fresh hay in the goat pen, she was already putting her plan into action. I noticed her from the corner of my eye, standing at the edge of her pristine lawn, phone glued to her ear, pacing like she was orchestrating some high-stakes operation. Her expression was sharp, lips pressed tight, eyes locked onto my barn as if she were willing it to burst into flames. I didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. She was making her move. I found out later that Karen had been busy for weeks, filing complaint after complaint with every county office she could think of. First, she tried zoning enforcement, claiming my farm wasn't properly designated for agriculture, even though it had been a working farm since before zoning laws even existed in this area. Next, she called the health department, insisting my livestock posed a sanitation risk. That one actually got me a visit from an inspector who left shaking his head after finding nothing wrong. Then, in what I can only assume was a desperate last-ditch effort, she contacted the fire marshal, alleging that my barn contained hazardous materials and was a fire risk to the neighborhood. It was all a waste of time. Each department came, took a look around, and left without finding a single thing out of order. If anything, the repeated inspections just proved how well I ran this farm. But that wasn't the real kicker. While Karen had been busy launching her personal war against me, she had no idea that she was already under investigation. It started a month ago when I noticed something was wrong with the creek that runs through my property. The water had turned murky, and there was a strange, chemical-like smell coming off of it. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor upstream had spilled something, but then I heard from another farmer a few miles away, his irrigation system was pulling in water that smelled just as bad. More reports started coming in, and soon enough, the county got involved. The Department of Environmental Conservation sent a team out to run water tests, and the results weren't good. The creek was contaminated with high levels of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, the kind used to keep golf courses and luxury landscaping looking perfect. The kind you'd find in a brand new HOA community trying to maintain an immaculate, color-coordinated aesthetic. The investigators quietly started tracing the source, following the drainage patterns, analyzing runoff points. And guess whose property sat right at the heart of the contamination zone? Karen's. Turns out, while she was out here screaming about my compost heap, her own landscapers had been over-applying chemical treatments for months, saturating the ground with fertilizers that washed straight into the creek every time it rained. The worst part? The HOA had already been warned once before. A county notice had been sent out advising them to cut back on chemical treatments to prevent runoff, but Karen, in her infinite wisdom, had ignored it completely. And the best part? She had no idea any of this was happening. She was so focused on making my life miserable that she failed to see the real storm brewing. That morning, when she paced her yard, throwing every bureaucratic dart she could at me, she had no clue that the county's environmental team was already gathering final evidence to hold her accountable. But that wasn't the only thing about to come crashing down on her. While I went about my morning, making sure the animals were fed and my tools were where they needed to be, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on my driveway. I turned to see a county sheriff's patrol car pulling in, the sunlight glinting off the badge on the door. Deputy Tom Reynolds stepped out, clipboard in hand, giving me a nod. "Mornin', Jack," he said, adjusting his belt as he walked over. "You got a minute?" I wiped my hands on my jeans. "Yeah, what's going on?" He glanced over at the creek, then back at me. "We got the final lab results. The county's pretty damn sure the runoff is coming from her side," he said, nodding toward Karen's property. "We're gonna need to take some more samples this morning, just to lock it all down." I smirked, shaking my head. "She's not gonna like that." "She doesn't have to," he replied. "She made this mess herself." As we talked, I heard the faint sound of a car engine revving hard from the other side of the property. I turned just in time to see Karen's SUV screeching out of her driveway and barreling toward us like a woman on a mission. I frowned, watching as she pulled up just beyond my fence line, the door flying open before the tires had even fully stopped. She jumped out, face flushed red with anger, phone clutched in her white-knuckled grip. I knew that look. And before she even opened her mouth, I knew exactly what she was about to do. She was about to call 911 on me. The only problem? The cops were already here. Karen stormed toward us, her heels digging into the soft earth as if she were stomping out a fire. Her phone was already in her hand, her thumb jabbing at the screen with frantic determination. I could hear the sharp, clipped tone of her voice as she spoke into the receiver, her free hand gesturing wildly in my direction. "Yes, I need to report suspicious activity on my neighbor's farm. He's dumping waste into the water supply. Yes, right now. I can see it happening." She turned her furious gaze on me, nostrils flaring as if she had caught me in some heinous act. I should have been surprised, but honestly, I wasn't. This was Karen, after all. She wasn't just grasping at straws, she was ripping them from the hay bale and lighting them on fire. The real kicker? Deputy Tom Reynolds, the actual law enforcement officer standing right next to me, was listening to the whole thing. I glanced at him, waiting to see how he'd react, but he just crossed his arms over his chest, watching her like an amused spectator at a circus. He made no move to stop her. He didn't have to. Karen was so caught up in her performance that she didn't even notice him until she heard the words, spoken in an even, measured tone. "Ma'am, I'm already here." Karen froze. Her phone was still pressed to her ear, but her mouth hung open slightly, eyes darting toward the badge pinned to Deputy Reynolds' uniform. For a brief, beautiful second, there was silence, realization dawning on her as the weight of her mistake settled in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over her phone. "Ma'am, did you say law enforcement is already on site?" Karen's face twitched. I could see the fight-or-flight instincts kicking in, the sheer indignation battling against reality. She clenched her jaw, squared her shoulders, and did what Karen did best, doubled down. "Well, then you need to send someone else because this officer is obviously compromised," she snapped, gripping her phone tighter. "He's probably in on it. This whole place is a cesspool of illegal activity." Deputy Reynolds let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Ma'am, do you even know what we're investigating today?" Karen blinked, mouth opening and closing like a fish struggling for air. She was so convinced that I was the villain that she hadn't even considered the idea that this wasn't about me at all. That's when the second patrol car pulled up. Deputy Daniel Garcia stepped out, adjusting his hat as he took in the scene. Unlike Reynolds, who had seen Karen's antics before, Garcia was new to the show. But the second his gaze landed on Karen's stiff posture, the aggressive way she was holding her phone, he let out a low sigh. "Let me guess," he muttered, glancing at Reynolds. "Karen?" Reynolds nodded. "Karen." Karen's mouth tightened. "Excuse me," she barked, as if the very act of using her name in that tone was a punishable offense. Deputy Garcia ignored her, turning his attention to me. "Jack, I assume you're still just existing out here?" I smirked. "Guilty as charged." Karen was seething, her entire body vibrating with frustration. She was losing control of the situation, and she knew it. But instead of backing down, she launched into a hysterical tirade, accusing me of polluting the environment, running an unregulated waste site, and, this was my personal favorite, letting farm animals roam free like some lawless backwater operation. She pointed dramatically at Peanut, my donkey, who was standing by the barn door, chewing on a piece of hay without a care in the world. "That animal is a menace," she shrieked. "He brays at ungodly hours. There has to be a noise ordinance violation somewhere." "Ma'am," Reynolds interrupted, his voice as steady as ever. "The real reason we're here today is to investigate the contamination of the creek. And we have reason to believe the source of the pollution is coming from your HOA's landscaping." The world stopped. Karen physically recoiled, like he had just slapped her across the face. What?" she stammered. Reynolds reached into his pocket and pulled out a small plastic container, holding it up for her to see. It was filled with murky, tainted water, a direct sample from the creek. "This was taken from the water flowing downstream from your property," he explained. "High levels of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, and chemical compounds that match the products used by your HOA's landscaping team." Karen turned ghost white. For the first time since I'd met her, she had nothing to say. And then, as if the universe itself wanted to truly nail the coffin shut, a third vehicle pulled up to my driveway. But this one wasn't a patrol car. It was a black, unmarked sedan. And stepping out from the driver's side was Detective Greg Morris, the lead investigator for the county's Environmental Crimes Division. Karen took one look at him, at the thick case file he was holding under his arm, the badge clipped to his belt, and she must have realized that this was far, far bigger than me, than my farm, than any petty little HOA rule she had tried to weaponize. Because suddenly, her bravado cracked. I saw the flicker of real fear in her eyes. She wasn't just dealing with a simple complaint anymore. She was the target of a full-scale investigation. Karen stood frozen, her face ashen as Detective Greg Morris strode toward her, flipping open the thick case file he carried. The scene around us had shifted. Just moments ago, she had been in full attack mode, smugly dialing 911, ready to sick the law on me like a rabid dog. But now, the tables had turned so hard that I almost felt bad for her. Almost. Detective Morris was a man who didn't waste words. He was here to do a job, and he had the kind of presence that made people realize they were in deep trouble before he even opened his mouth. He stopped in front of Karen, adjusted his badge, and glanced at the deputies. "What do we have here?" Deputy Reynolds smirked. "She called 911 on her neighbor. Turns out, we were already here investigating her." Morris lifted an eyebrow and turned to Karen, whose hands were now clenched into tight fists at her sides. "Miss Karen, is it?" She sucked in a sharp breath, straightening her posture. "Mrs. Karen, and I have done nothing wrong," she snapped, her voice laced with forced confidence. "This entire situation is a misunderstanding. That man," she jabbed a finger in my direction, "has been polluting the creek with his animals and compost heap. He refuses to follow basic community standards, and I have been forced to report him multiple times." Morris didn't so much as blink. "Is that right?" He calmly flipped through a few pages in his file before holding up a document with her own signature on it. "Then maybe you can explain why the chemical compounds in the water match the fertilizer orders you personally authorized." Karen's mouth parted slightly, her breath hitching. She shook her head. "That's impossible." Morris didn't break eye contact. "It's not. We traced the contamination back to your HOA's landscaping practices. Multiple large-scale orders of high-potency fertilizers and pesticides were placed under your name, above the county's legal limit for safe application. The HOA was already warned about runoff risks in this area. You ignored those warnings, didn't you?" Karen's face went blotchy red, her eyes darting between the file, the deputies, and me. I never." "Karen." A new voice cut through the tension. I turned just in time to see George Whitman, the HOA president, stepping out of his black SUV. He looked thoroughly pissed, his face tight with frustration as he stormed toward her. This was going to be good. "I just got a call from the board," he said, barely looking at anyone else. "They told me you've been illegally using HOA funds to pursue legal action against Jack. You've been sending complaints to zoning, health departments, the fire marshal, without board approval." Karen flinched. "I was protecting the neighborhood, George." George wasn't having it. "By filing a bogus lawsuit against a man who doesn't even belong to our HOA? By secretly draining our legal fund?" His voice rose. "You didn't even tell us about the environmental violations." Karen's eyes darted wildly. "Those are just allegations, nothing has been proven." Morris flipped another page in his file. "Actually, Miss Karen, it's already proven. We've got security footage of your landscapers dumping excess chemicals along the creek bed, the same area flagged for contamination. We also have witness testimony from your landscaping contractor, Travis Bennett, who confirmed you personally instructed him to exceed standard application rates." That was the moment Karen truly cracked. Her whole body tensed, her hands trembling. "That's a lie," she spat. "Travis is covering his own ass. I only told him to ensure the flowers looked perfect for the annual tour. That's all. This is a conspiracy." You're all ganging up on me." George shook his head, disgusted. "You have any idea what you've done, Karen? The HOA is liable for this. The county is about to hit us with thousands in fines because of your reckless decisions." Karen let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, please. The HOA can afford it. We have a reserve fund." "No," George cut in. "We don't. Because you drained it." A stunned silence fell over the group. Karen's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. That's not possible," she whispered, but she wasn't fooling anyone. Detective Morris sighed, clearly ready to wrap this up. "Miss Karen, I suggest you stop talking before you dig yourself any deeper. Right now, we have enough evidence to file formal charges for environmental negligence, misuse of HOA funds, and falsifying reports to authorities. If you want to make a statement, I suggest you do it downtown with a lawyer present." Karen's whole body went rigid, her lips pressed so tightly together they turned white. Then, like the absolute Karen she was, she pointed a shaking finger at me one last time. "This is his fault," she shrieked. "If he had just followed our standards, if he had just painted his barn a normal color, stopped letting his filthy animals wander around, none of this would have happened." Judy, who had been standing quietly on the porch until now, finally spoke. "You're unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "For months, you've harassed my husband, wasted public resources, accused him of nonsense, and now you're blaming him for your crimes?" She let out a short, bitter laugh. "Karen, you did this to yourself." The weight of those words must have finally sunk in, because for the first time, Karen looked genuinely rattled. Deputy Reynolds stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt. "Miss Karen, it's time to come with us." She stiffened. "You're arresting me?" "For now, you'll be questioned at the station," Morris said, closing his file. "If you cooperate, maybe we can settle this before the county moves forward with felony charges." "Felony?" Karen swayed slightly. She must have known, on some level, that this was a possibility, but hearing it out loud shattered whatever delusions she had left. She wasn't the victim here. She wasn't in control. She was screwed. A patrol car pulled up behind her, its lights flashing. I watched as the full weight of her actions finally settled on her shoulders. Karen had spent months trying to destroy me. And in the end, she had buried herself instead. The patrol car door shut with a firm click, sealing Karen inside as she sat stiff-backed, her face frozen somewhere between rage and disbelief. The flashing lights cast sharp streaks of red and blue against her manicured lawn, a fitting contrast to the pristine, artificial perfection she had spent years enforcing. For months, she had tried to bend this farm, my farm, to her will, convinced that her self-appointed authority could override history, law, and common sense. Now, she wasn't just dealing with a petty dispute. She was looking at real consequences. Detective Morris gave me a nod, slipping his file back under his arm. "We'll be in touch," he said, his tone businesslike. "The county will be pursuing this case aggressively. With the amount of evidence we have, I wouldn't be surprised if this turns into a full-scale legal battle between the HOA and the Environmental Commission." He glanced toward the patrol car. "As for her, she's got a long road ahead." The HOA president, George Whitman, pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling heavily. "She's finished," he muttered. "The board won't stand behind her after this. The legal fees alone," he trailed off, shaking his head. "We'll cooperate fully with the county. Whatever it takes to clean up this mess." Karen's SUV sat abandoned in her driveway, its driver's side door flung open from when she had come storming onto my property, so sure she was about to bring me down. Now, she was gone, her righteous fury reduced to empty threats through a glass window. Judy stepped beside me, her arms crossed as we both watched the patrol car roll away, leaving behind nothing but the sound of the orchard leaves rustling in the breeze. "Well," she said finally, "that was something." I huffed out a laugh, shaking my head. "Karen tried to call 911 on me," I said, almost disbelieving even though I had just lived through it. "Turns out, the police were already here for her." Judy chuckled, slipping her arm through mine. "I hope she enjoys HOA meetings from a courtroom." As we turned back toward the house, Peanut the donkey let out a triumphant bray from the barn, as if celebrating the restored peace. The farm, our land, remained exactly as it always had, free, untamed, and untouched by HOA nonsense. Karen might have thought she could rewrite history, but the land had a way of standing its ground. Have you ever had to deal with a Karen or a power-hungry HOA? Share your worst experiences below. Let's see who had it worse.